Text on a pink and blue gradient background, by Pride UK's Bi-Fi Festival. Title, Unicorn, by, Pan and Trans Representation in Arts and Culture panel, featuring, Suri Mukherjee, Chair, Jordan Gray, she, her, Kai Hazelwood, she, her, 1990s Chris, he, him, Maddie Jones, she, her.
Welcome to the Bi-Fi Festival Unicorn panel on Bi-Pan and Trans Representation in Arts and Culture. And we also have a donate button somewhere here on screen, which will donate to Bi-Pride UK, which is a volunteer-run charity that does a lot of work to support the queer communities. And here today in this awesome panel, Unicorn panel, I mean, it's got to be awesome, we have artist activist Kai Hazelwood, who goes by she, her. We have comedian Jordan Gray, who was also the first transgender person to be on The Voice, who also goes by she, her. We have writer 1990s Chris, who goes by he, him. And we have Maddie Jones, who's right now filling in for Am I couldn't make it because they're quarantining in Italy and the connection is not great. So we've lucked out with Maddie, who's a freelance musician and is also also works on the Unicorn magazine. So first of all, welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for making time to be on this amazing Unicorn panel. So we're going to talk about media representation. I think that's very exciting because we're all involved in the media in different ways. So could we start with growing up? What was that one representation that you saw on screen or heard in music or anywhere really, which made you feel like that's me and you felt that for the first time?
Well, for me, I suppose, because I'm a transgender woman, but I didn't transition until later in life. So growing up, anything that I just transcended gender altogether. Characters that were larger than life, like say Michael Jackson or David Bowie, whose sexuality was maybe a little bit mysterious, then gender and sexuality sort of became irrelevant, which was nice. It was nice to feel like, those people, like it wasn't going to be an issue for the rest of our life. If you just get as famous as David Bowie, you never have to think about it again.
So I think for me, one of the first times I sort of saw something and thought, oh, maybe there are things in the world that kind of make me think this different way, and that this kind of way of being is something out there. I remember seeing the music video to Placebo's Nancy Boy, and just kind of seeing these men be these different versions of men that I hadn't ever kind of seen before. And it was kind of really exciting and intriguing. It kind of led me into a whole world of other stuff.
I didn't really grow up with access to TV and movies. My parents were not big on those kinds of things. I didn't really see anything in media until I was a bit older, and it was the L Word. It blew my mind because, oh my God, they were like all these people and they were discussing these things. And the funny thing is you can go back and watch it now and find all the problematic storylines and be like, ooh, but then realize that for the time, it was quite ahead of its time. And then also indicative of my childhood, I think the first earliest representations I had that things could be different than the way they looked around me was Star Trek. There's actually transgender story arcs in it, queer story arcs in it, and all these things that just sort of opened my little mind up to the idea that things could be different without even really knowing what that meant at the time.
Actually got a similar experience to you, Kai, in that I was going to mention the L Word. So I grew up identifying as lesbian, and it actually wasn't until my early 20s that I started to realise that I wanted to identify more as bi, and that encompassed my sexuality. I would say a lot of my teenage years were spent watching the L Word and feeling like that was a gateway to queer culture that I couldn't have at a time when I couldn't sort of go out and go to clubs and things. But also Torchwood was a big one for me. I know quite a lot of the bi and pan representation is quite tokenistic in hindsight, but as a kid you didn't really have any other way of seeing that. It was a fantastic thing to really get into.
Yeah, so like I totally feel that, like, for example, in India right now there's so many more and more like queer movies coming out, and there's always like some critique of it, like it didn't get this right or that right, but at the same time it's like, how amazing is this, to just even be able to see yourself, even if it's like just a glimpse or it's imperfect. It's like, finally we've arrived, and all of those other things, it doesn't start to matter until much later. And that brings me to my next question, which is, what does the most memorable queer representation you've seen in recent times? And it can be something good or bad, but just something that stuck out for you.
There's this amazing trope of like, most recently, the character that comes to mind is this character of Rick Sanchez from the very popular adult TV animation Rick and Morty. But it trails back through characters like the Deadpool superhero played by Ryan Reynolds, and like the Benedict Cumberbatch Sherlock Holmes. All these characters, these fantastical characters that have essentially, intellectually, they've been able to transcend, some of them, like time and space altogether. And they are all, not explicitly, but they are all described within the show as pansexual characters, even if it's just circumstantial. It's so usualized that it's hardly mentioned unless, like, there's no story arcs about it, but it's just circumstantially they happen to be pansexual. And I think it's this idea that I like that pansexuality just becomes like an inevitable conclusion of advanced intellect. The idea that once you've transcended time and space, then gender and sexuality sort of becomes secondary. And these characters that are massively flawed, they also have sort of reached this point. It's pansexuality and nihilism. Those two things are what really, really clever people sort of land on. So yeah, weird that these shows that have very heteronormative followings like Rick and Morty, you've got this character at the head of it, he's in the title, and he's a pansexual. I just thought that was really interesting to mention.
I think for me, one series that's been particularly important is Pose. I think the amount of sort of trans and queer representation, both in the cast, the production crew, just everything. It's been fantastic, and I think it's really encompassed the spirit of the community, and that's been really nice to see, that it isn't just a case of going, these are characters that are fulfilling a brief. It's going, actually, we're going to show well-rounded people and what their lives were like.
Yeah, I want to second that about Pose. I've watched it a couple times through, and I just sit and like cry through the whole thing because I love it so much, and for a lot of reasons. But one of the key ones for me is that it's an opportunity where I get to see all these Black and brown people. And oftentimes it is not the case when it comes to queer representation. So to have an entire show that's chock full of these beautiful, audacious people who are taking care of each other and creating their own family structures, it just, I weep through the entire thing, and then it ends, and then I start over because it brings me so much joy.
Another one for me as well is Sex Education on Netflix. It's one of those shows where with my queer friends, like we just like have chatted about it and all of the different characters, and because of the kind of way the show is presented, it makes you talk about your own kind of awakenings and stuff. So I've had some really like fun, nice conversations with people like based on that show, and I think that's really nice. And a few people that I didn't know they were queer or whatever that are in my life, like kind of ended up coming out because we've been talking about the show in like really offhanded ways, which is really interesting and really nice. And I think that's the important thing about like, TV and art stuff, to be able to like give you really nice conversations in real life. I especially think the bi representation in that is really good.
Speaking of bi representation in specific, do we think that bi erasure is something that's still happening in the media?
Miss America, it's a show on Hulu that sort of it goes through the women's movement in the 60s and 70s. And that movement was really closely interwoven with gay and lesbian rights orgs at the time. And so one of them is married to a man and has an experience with a woman, and then is asked by Gloria Steinem in the show, I don't know if this really happened, oh, so you're a lesbian now. Meanwhile, she's still married to her husband, and they're getting ready to have a child. And she says, like, I love my husband. I just, this is also a part of who I am. And it was such a wild question to me. Like, that was the only option. Like, she flipped a switch and now she's lesbian. And it was so strange. It's like, there it is.
Oh, but just quickly, there's a new show on Netflix. I think it's called Star Force, and it's Steve Carell, John Malkovich, and Steve Carell's partner is the beloved Lisa Kudrow, and she's, I don't want to spoil it for anyone if you've not seen it. She's in prison, and it's an all-female prison, And there's a point where she speaks to her husband about the idea that she'd like to open up their marriage because she's met somebody, and she has this discussion with her daughter, and the language that's used is really interesting, because her daughter says, "Oh, what, are you a lesbian now?" And Lisa Kudrow's character, I can't remember her name, says, "No, but I'm not 100% straight either," rather than jumping to that middle label, which I think is maybe a way to appease audiences in a certain way of saying, if you think of it in mathematical terms, it's easier than us giving you this whole other island to jump to of bisexuality in the middle. So it's sort of problematic, isn't it? That's a nice way of breaching that subject, but it could go further. I don't know. It's where does it land, where it hits and communicates with the most people.
Yeah, I enjoy irritating people, and so I get asked that question quite a bit in that language. Like, well, what percentage gay are you? I get that a lot, and so my favorite new answer is, well, I'm 100% bisexual. Does that help? No? Okay, good. The danger with that language is that it gatekeeps what bisexuality is. Because if we're thinking about it in mathematical terms, then you have to be 50% straight, 50% gay, and you land on this magical island of bisexuality. And that is so not the actual experience of so many people. And we all spend then a ton of time that could be saved if we knew that having any desires in that way gave us a home. But the amount of people that I talk to who say things like, "Oh, I didn't know what it applied to me because I didn't think I was gay enough to be bi." That's crazy.
Yeah.
So I feel like we really have to move away from this language of percentages, because it really does a disservice to people getting to claim whatever feels like the authentic version of bi-ness, queerness for them. Rant over, soapbox rescinded.
I think it's also in a way dissecting being bi or pan in a way that monosexuals don't really have to deal with. There's that idea of you have to justify your sexuality and really explain, this is why I fit in this box, instead of actually taking that person's lived experience and saying, this is how I feel I am, this is how I feel I love, that's my reality, and that's the word I'm choosing to use that, and that encompasses my community.
Yeah, and I've been asked like so many times, it's been, oh my God, it's almost like harassment, where they tell you to like choose one gender, and I'm sitting there having a conversation with someone for 15 minutes just saying like, I cannot pick one, you know?
Yeah, I was just talking about first dates and how, those women telling those men that they were bisexual was just really interesting, because the reaction, like, this is like, that was the kind of the first bisexual representation I think I've seen on TV on a dating show, like in that format sort of thing. So I was quite interested to see how it would be handled. And it was very interesting because both the men had like different like reactions, but they were one of the tropes around what people think. They were like, oh, so like one guy was just like, oh, so it was a bit of a phase then. Yeah, he was so keen for it to be a phase, and you could kind of see that he didn't know how to handle it, so he was just hoping it wasn't much of a thing. And that was just really interesting to see that. And then the other guy was very much like, well, that's hot sort of thing. So it's just like one or the other. You know, I guess I get caught in my bubble sometimes, that I talk to people that are sound and know about this stuff. So when you see it on TV and the kind of average kind of guy's reaction to that, it's like so incomprehensible to them that there could be this person that just actually is what they consider in between.
Yeah, I think with women it's also the fact that it's like our sexuality is just not taken seriously enough, you know. So
yeah, no,
like it's just seen as like fluff, like not something real, you know. It's just like a fun fact about me, you know, you can have a threesome. That's literally what they think coming out as bi is.
Generally speaking, what I find really interesting is when you have sitcoms and things, people will be assumed to be straight unless proven otherwise, and if they're otherwise, they're very firmly placed in this monosexual bracket. There's very rarely any nuanced discussion about whether people could be dating someone of one gender and also be attracted to people of other genders. It tends to be quite pigeonholed, and I think it can be quite difficult, because it means that then opening that conversation with people in real life is you don't really have a reference point a lot of the time that isn't in some way derogatory, or as you've said, like you can have a threesome or you sleep with everybody because you like more than one gender.
I just remembered, has anyone seen Brooklyn Nine-Nine? There's a fantastic representation in that. That just popped into my head. What's her name? Rosa Diaz. So she's fairly sure she's got like a male partner throughout most of it, but the conversation still comes up while she's dating somebody else. That's a really interesting thing as well. I think Chris was touching on it with like the tropes of, one of the big tropes of bisexuality, of course, is an inherent promiscuity. And I think that's just people doing the math in their head of thinking, man plus woman, that's more than 2 people, that's 3 people.
Yeah, I love Brooklyn Nine-Nine. It is a great and very fun show. And I love that they included this queer arc, because there's no reason in the design or frame of the show that calls for it, but the actor that plays Rosa Diaz is bi. And so I feel like she had this wonderful opportunity to do that. My only complaint is that when she defines what bisexuality means to her, it is the sort of attracted to men and women model, which is a model that I work really hard to remind people is not actually inherently in the bi term. We acknowledge attraction to genders that are similar to mine and different than mine. It's much more inclusive than that. So I was like, oh, so close, so close.
I mean, it's, you know, like now that you say it, I realize it's problematic in the same way. But in Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, you know, when that character, I don't remember his name, but it's like he starts to like, he realizes that he also likes men. And I was like, oh my God, they're going to make this like, oh, he's gay now, or like, oh, he's realized he's gay, you know, like I thought that's where it would go. And then they have a whole song about the fact that he's into men and women and he's bisexual. But of course, you know, we still have a long way to go. What does everyone here think about how are we doing on trans representation? I mean, I wouldn't say great, but you can tell me why.
In infotainment, entertainment, like people trying to get the idea of what transgenderism is across in these short videos. And you'll have a overtly homosexual or homophobic or transphobic character that just declares it really obviously and explicitly, and people don't talk like that in real life, so they just become this strange little straw man that we can all say, look how silly they are. Look, but the fact that no one just, oh, you know, get out of here, you freak. People don't really talk like that. Transphobia tends to be a lot more implicit, and you see that, and it kind of devalues the struggle a little bit. We're trying to say to the audience, look, this is what you shouldn't do, but they're like, we don't do that. Nobody talks like that. So just the push to not demonize and create these strange straw men would be a nice push in the right direction.
I think following on from that, though, it's an interesting discussion to have, how you represent microaggressions on screen in a way that isn't just reinforcing what the people watching it and maybe do these things, because they won't necessarily get the nuance without it being quite so over the top.
Overt, yeah.
I think with stuff like this, I just think, and particularly with the issue of trans representation and like representation generally, you just need more, like, you need more creators with a platform that are like, you need more trans creators that are writing stuff, making stuff, and like that's the way that things get better. I think it's like, I don't know if we're going to wait for, you know, like a straight middle class white man to write some good trans representation like that, like everyone's kind of missed the point a little bit. Like that will have to happen in some ways to kind of move on, but a lot of the time the issues are like kind of the gatekeeping on the creation of culture rather than how people that are already making it are making it, if that makes sense.
We just made a show, created a show for Comedy Central called Transaction. I didn't have a say in the name, as you might have guessed that, but again, it's just they need to get that information out there. What was really lovely about the Comedy Central, you say, talking about these gatekeepers, yes, it was predominantly like white, cisgender, heterosexual people around. It was nice that they handed that over and said, you know, we're not going to argue with what the transgender experience is. And what I would always say back is, well, this is my experience about how one person's ego is tied to their transgenderism, because we get held up a lot. You know, when we're around, it's what people talk about. It's, you know, we sort of are put on a bit of a pedestal. And it's interesting we were trying to show in the show, which I recommend people watch, Transaction on social media. Oddly, the fact that it was created by me and a group of heteronormative white people, it meant that we were able to hold on to the form and the tropes that people that viewing that platform recognized, but the story was very authentically transgender. So it's this weird mix that, like, fingers crossed, it seems to be creating a nice little bridge between those two communities.
I agree a lot with what 1990s Chris was saying about really needing to have people be empowered to tell their own stories. Because I was thinking about particularly, I don't know if this is different in other parts of the world, but if I were to ask someone what are the most memorable trans characters that they've seen in film or TV, most of the ones that they would identify are played by cisgender people. So I think there's a chance now they might not be a serial killer character, because I think we've moved past that trope like a tiny bit. So there's a chance they might not be a serial killer. So I think the work that I really see needing to be done from my perspective is, hey, what if we don't make it an Oscar opportunity for a straight dude, like a cisgender straight dude? It's just like an idea. So I'm waiting for that.
But yeah, like, okay, so there's this, one Indian show, it's called Sacred Games, it's on Netflix, and it's quite good. But they had a transgender character, which they had, a trans woman, and they had a cis woman playing it, which was different, but still not ideal. But a lot of people hailed that as like a great character. It was a very memorable character. It's something which really was like the glue of the show, you can say, in many ways. But in the end, what happens? She kills herself. Why? Because like her partner saw her naked. And it's like, why? Like, why must everything be so tragic always? Yeah. A part of you wants to be like, oh yeah, at least maybe a little bit step, like it's not a comedy trope anymore. But at the same time, it's still like so problematic. What you gonna do? And which brings me to intersectionality. We've talked about sexual orientation, we've talked about gender, we've talked a little bit about different kinds of identities, for like race, for example. But there's such a way to go. I feel like now we've started seeing some queer characters, but they're still gonna be like from particular class, they're still gonna be white, they're usually gonna be male. And that's still like, something that we're seeing. So what are your thoughts on intersectionality? Have you seen like some amazing examples of it? Or do you have some ideas in mind which you would like to see but we haven't?
I am thirsty AF, as the kids say, for more intersectionality in queer characters. I love me a cisgender white gay. They are not in danger of disappearing from screens or stages. They're good. I would love to see more other representation and more nuance in what queer means. I want to give way more space to bi and queer men. I feel like that is something that is really, really still absent. If you're bi, obviously you're gay as a man. You're just in denial and you're gay. We just gave a little speech at virtual Pride here in LA 2 days ago. And especially given everything that's happening in America right now, I feel this really strong tension between getting to show up somewhere as queer or Black, but very rarely both. And I know I'm not the only person that feels that way. At this virtual Pride event, and I'm in the waiting room and I'm looking around, and there's like one other Black person out of, 50 plus presenters. There's one Black trans person who didn't even get to go on. So in a 3.5 hour event, there are 2 Black presenters, me and one other person. Almost everyone in this event wanted to say something about Black Lives Matter, but to watch white person after white person after white person after white person after white person make their heartfelt statements and quote MLK in a way that makes me gag, it just felt really disappointing and also not at all representative of the part of the queer community that I live in or that I want to see out in the world. And I feel like there's a lot more work in that way to be done. And I think part of it involves giving people the space to make things that you might not like. I feel like because we're so used to looking at queer media through a specific lens, that when someone makes something that doesn't fit into that, it's torn apart in a way that is really destructive. And to me, it seems as if it's because you're wanting an apple and someone gave you a delicious pineapple and you were like, but you failed at being the Granny Smith apple that I wanted, and therefore you failed. And anyway, I'm off on another tangent. I have a lot of feelings about this.
Intersectionality, yeah.
Yes, there's a lot of work to do.
So I find that, as Kai was saying, that there's quite a lot of limited representation of queer men, especially bi men, that don't fit that kind of white affluent kind of that ideal. And it's really interesting when I put work out and I share stuff about being bisexual in a kind of working class context, it's met quite often with this kind of weird reaction that I find quite strange, which is that it's really brave of me to do it. I'm really putting myself out there, and I'm like, and to me, it doesn't really feel like that. It just feels very matter of fact. That's just my life, that I'm just talking about it. That's just, you know, almost like I make a lot of work that's not the point of it, but my sexuality is there, my class background is there, because that's the context in which I see the whole world. So just like if I'm writing about work, if I'm writing about other things, then it's still there. And it's strange that people have this reaction, which is very much that like I'm doing something really risky. I'm like risking something massively by doing it. And I do think it is because like representations of bisexuality and often race and like lots of things are basically like that the kind of the point that bit of the identity is in the piece of work is because that's the narrative arc, like that's the point of it. Like we need that bit about their identity because that's the story. Whereas, you know, me being bi and a man being working class, that's not like just my story, you know, like it's interesting like how, you know, people just kind of boil it down to that. And it's because it's much easier for people to kind of digest it, because actually life is really complicated and people have lots of different things about them. And I think a lot of the time it's that people kind of underestimate, I guess, what audiences can take on and what audiences can understand, because they know people in real life that are really complicated and a big Venn diagram of lots of different things. I think that a lot of the time people just want to play it safe with what they put out because they know that's happened before. And I think, like I was saying, like, you know, like it's just about taking some of those risks and being like, actually, people will respond to this because it's like a very human thing. Like we all have, within all of us, there's different intersections of life, and just by letting there be representation for rounded characters, that comes out more naturally. And things are so dominated by people that don't think about those things all the time. If you're not thinking about the intersections that you have in your own identity, then that's privilege, because, you know, I don't think about my race very much because I'm white. So like it's those things that if you have people that are kind of the people that commission the work, have the platforms for the work, if they don't think about those things very much, it's very hard for people that have to overcome those barriers to get that work out there and for people to see it, which is a real shame, because it would definitely enrich like all of our lives for sure.
I think as well that's a real problem with the intersection with ableism, particularly in queer content. I mean, it's obviously there are already issues with accessibility in queer spaces and making sure that websites and things are as accessible as possible, but there isn't very much representation at all in media content of visually impaired or audio impaired or wheelchair users, people with invisible illnesses. All of these things are sort of pushed to the side and ignored instead of exploring that really rich idea of how those things can all interact, how they can build a person.
Yeah, I can tell you, so I'm the artistic director of a group called Good Troublemakers here in LA, and our mission is sort of at the intersection of queerness, POC, and disabled folks, and how we all work together. And especially given that we're a movement-based collaborative, many of us come from dance backgrounds. It's shocking to me how far behind we are at embracing accessibility in the arts, particularly in dance. I had the opportunity to bring Alice Shepard, who's one of the leading disabled dance artists in the world right now, to LA to give workshops. And I'm pretty well plugged into the dance scene here in LA. And I think 9 people came to her workshop. It was also donation only, and Alice was donating her time to do this. And it blew my mind that if I had brought in a white cisgender abled artist, I would have had 30 people in the class. But people were so scared to be in a space where they might not be centered that they didn't come, despite the fact that she is, you know, known throughout the world and in dance, probably the best known disabled artist at this moment. And I talked to someone in our collaborative who went, and she said, I'll tell you, I had a moment of like, oh, I think this might be uncomfortable. I don't want to do anything wrong, but you know what? I'm going to show up and go. And I feel like that's the piece that's missing in the way we're approaching a lot of these things is if you're not used to not being the center of the conversation, it can be very uncomfortable to allow yourself to be on the side. But if you don't do that, our lives are flatter and more boring and less diverse and less interesting and less challenging. So like, how do we empower people to have the incredible experience of not being the center of the conversation? And some of us experience that all the time because it's just our lived experience and we're very comfortable with it. But it blew my mind that, all these artists who consider themselves allies and so progressive couldn't turn out for a workshop by this incredible artist because, oh my God, maybe they shouldn't go and like, maybe it's not for them and like, ugh. So yes, Maddie, I agree with you.
So of course, what I'd like to do is just like play devil's advocate for the sake of stimulating conversation. I hope it goes without saying I am in total agreement, like 100% agreement with what everyone's saying. But I do work in TV and media, and this is not me defending. Please don't think that's what's about to happen at all. Just I have that experience. So writing writing the character that I wrote for myself. I'm a white transgender bisexual woman. In real life, I'm bisexual, but I'm married to a cisgender lady. There was a conversation about, and I'm relating this to intersectionality and bi-erasure, I suppose, this conversation of, in comedy, every signal that you're giving off, every single thing about you is a signifier of what we're supposed to take from that skit, that sketch, or that bit. Because comedy is a very delicate thing. You change one thing and the joke don't work. In the show, she's pursuing or is being pursued by gentlemen, by men throughout. And it's the conversation that we had was that not that we wouldn't build to it down the line, but out of the gate, it complicated the story to the point where that story didn't make sense. So then the answer to that is, well, write a different story. But that's where the intersectionality comes in. I don't have another story to write because I don't have experiences of those other, I can't push it into, I am an able-bodied person, if I believe that's the correct term. So yeah, I'm in this small box. And anything that we did to change things around, I think it's when you maybe 2 or 3 things about a person, 2 or 3 Venn diagram confluences, it becomes such a complicated thing. Outside the realms of comedy, it's different. Of course, in drama, it's a very different thing. But when you're writing comedy, all those things send off a signal that does completely change what people feel they're supposed to get, especially when it's a divided audience. So I think, yeah, that as a deconstructionist view, that's how intersectionality kind of ends up not getting represented in comedy.
The amazing thing about what you just said is that you said that's not my lived experience, and so I'm perhaps not the best person to represent that. I don't feel a lot of other people or other writers feel that. I know white cisgender straight male writers here in LA who of course I can write that. I'm a writer. I'm great at it. I'm just gonna do it. And I feel like that's when you end up with these very flattened characters that are not fully realized people. So first of all, kudos for recognizing when it's an experience that's so far out of your own that perhaps somebody else needs to be in the room. And I also feel like that's part of the issue, is recognizing that being a talented writer does not mean you should write everybody. It doesn't mean they shouldn't be in your show. It just means that you should hire somebody else who can bring a different perspective.
So speaking of that, all of you are creatives doing exciting work in the field. So how are you thinking? Are you thinking about representation when you set out to write something or do something?
I think it's something that we tried to carry over. Like Community is one of my favorite shows of all time. And they had a casting process whereby the writing, the characters were these fully realized people outside of race and gender. So that's what we did with ours. That's the small consolation that we could do, is that if there was a character that didn't have anything linked to anything else, then we just up that intersectionality, we up that limit just as standard. It's don't just fill that with a white person, basically. That's all that's my only experience of it, because then it gets handed over to somebody that knows a lot more what they're doing.
So I made a short film the start of this year about a bisexual character that works in a factory, and it was set in a very sort of rural place, and we filmed it in a very rural place. It was quite difficult to get people involved in the shoot that weren't white straight men from London. So we just took a little bit more time and pushed things back a little bit to try and we wanted to push for an all queer cast and crew. So and we actually did get that in the end, which is really cool. But it took that little bit of extra time to just be like, you know, and we definitely like stressed ourselves out massively, because we were like, well, we need to tie everything up by the end of next week. We held out and it was worth it. It just took a lot more effort than just kind of the usual channels of casting and finding crew. We just like talked to everybody that we knew that might know people in that area. I think just taking that extra time and really caring about it made a whole load of difference to the whole process. So I guess, yeah, little things like that, yeah, that can make something feel a bit uplifted in that way and feel a bit more special. It definitely felt special to be on that set.
Actually, I was going to talk more about Unicorn, if that's all right, because I think that actually it's been a real education for me. I joined Unicorn in February, and while I've sort of dealt with the idea of bi-representation in my own work, the idea of representing the whole community, both through contributors, but also even things down to GIFs, visuals, anything that people can look at something and see themselves in that and feel like part of the bi community. I think it's something that I've been really keen to learn more about, and it's something that I'm absolutely happy to say I don't yet do enough of, and I'm learning about. And I think that's actually a really important part of any of the conversations. It's to say I'm not perfect, but I am trying, and I will keep trying, and I will keep learning. And so that's a really big part of what I'm doing there.
First, Maddie, you made me think that one of the tenets in our mission is the queer art of failure, which is recognizing that when you're trying to build a brand new system, you're going to find things that don't work, and you're going to have to go, I have to restart. And I found it really helpful for me to embrace that from the start, so that then when I do fail at something, it's like, cool, we're doing the thing we set out to do, instead of like, oh God, I got it wrong. So that's definitely part of the way we work. And for me, first of all, came up hardcore in the ballet world. So representation was certainly not something that anybody was thinking of. And for me personally, it became abundantly clear very early that it also wasn't something that I needed to think about, because the second I set foot on stage was a political statement just by being a Black person in ballet, especially at that time. So in our group, I started thinking about the idea of representation and wanting to make it deeper than that, because there's something that feels on the outside to me about the way something is represented. So a lot of our work is actually behind the scenes, and it's in things like we often work in models like this. Our membership has to be either majority or at minimum 50-50 BIPOC folks. So if we find 4 white artists that we want to work with, awesome, they can work with us, but none of them can join our group until we have a corresponding number of people of color that can join the group, to make sure that internally we're upholding the values that we want to have in the world. In terms of how we recruit people is along those same lines, because I feel like the trouble people run into is they use the same channels they've always used. Chris was talking about this, the same channels you've always used, but want to find different people. It's not going to work. You have to have a different recruiting strategy from the start. So I'm actually constantly recruiting people all the time, and those people may not even know it. And it can be as simple as I collect artists that I love on Instagram, and when I have things coming up, I reach out to those artists, and I usually already have a bench of a ton of POC queer artists that I want to work with, because I've been collecting them forever. And so I feel like often the challenge is that people want to get representation in the final stage of something, and that's not how it works. It has to be embedded in every step of your process and your organization or your project, or it's not going to happen in that last step. And the number of times I hear people say things like, well, I just can't find anyone. There just isn't a talented fill in the blank person. And it's like, no, that's not true at all. You just don't know them. And if you are recruiting for something, it is your job to make sure that you know them. And if you don't, there's a piece of your job that still needs to be done. We do a lot of that in our work at Troublemaker, top to bottom.
Yeah, that is a massively helpful tip, because I personally have heard that so much, like, for example, like at open mics in Cardiff, when I and some of my other peers of like POC people doing spoken word, like we brought it up as an issue that there was always like the representation was just underwhelming, and it was always but there aren't like everyone's welcome to come but they're not coming, or things like that. And this is my bit that I do for representation, is like every Pride or pride related stuff, I make sure to dress super Indian, because it's like I'm very queer and I'm very Indian. We can exist together because I exist, right? Thank you so much. Thank you all of you for your lovely, lovely insights. I really feel like, you know, we've had conversations that we don't see elsewhere, and that's amazing that we have the platform to do that right now.
Text on a pink and blue gradient background, by Pride UK's Bi-Fi Festival. An animated Wi-Fi symbol beams above the logo.